Good evening. It certainly is a pleasure to be with you here this evening. Considering my circumstance, I imagine it would be a pleasure for me to be anywhere this evening. Actually, I will tell you that being here tonight is the direct result of a special dispensation. I shall not, however, tell you from whom. Some things best left unsaid. I arrived here earlier today and I spent some time meandering around your beautiful town. I must say, you have about the friendliest folks I ever did meet. Walking around and folks was coming up to me and saying howdy and shaking my hand and waving to me from their automobiles, bidding me welcome. If I didn't know better, I swear I was in Missouri. After talking to them, it became clear they was under a false impression. They thought I was somebody else. I should like to know who this Colonel Sanders is. They tell me he's just a fine Southern gentleman. Sounds to me like he's just a chicken farmer. They said I dress like he does. I dress like he does. That's how they mistook me. I assured them it were the other way around. Just like this. Anyway, been a good while since I've done this speech. In fact, it was September 2nd, 1895. Oh, we were in the beautiful new Lyceum Theater in the historic city of Baltimore. Oh, what a night that was. Beautiful theater. Red and purple curtains hanging down everywhere. A man can stand in the middle of that stage and whisper. The folks in the back row go, yeah, that's right. Beautiful. But the topic tonight, for tonight's reading, is the Civil War. Now I'm going to tell the truth about this. I want to set the record straight. Exactly what went on. We're going to be honest whether we like it or not. You should always tell the truth. It'll confound your enemies and astonish your friends. So for tonight's part, well, before we get going any further, I want to say thank you very much. Mary Ellen, where's Mary Ellen? Right here. Well, thank you very much for this beautiful book bag she gave me. This fancy writing on it. I really appreciate it. Of course, I want to say thank you to your lovely husband, Lemoyne, for arranging this meeting. Now, it makes me kind of nervous that he'd hold that much sway with my boss. Y'all must know better than I do. It's called the private history of a campaign that failed. Now, unlike George Washington, who could never tell a lie, I can. I ain't gonna. Not tonight. I have my notes from when I last read this, and it's been a long while since I've done this. I want to make sure that we're accurate. Now, you have by this time no doubt heard from a great many people who did something in the Civil War. Here it is, 30 years post, and you still can't swing a dead cat without hitting a storyteller someplace. And each story more grandiose than the last. This is not fair and right that you listen a moment to one who started out to do something in the Civil War, but didn't. There were thousands entered the war. Got just a taste of it and stepped out again. Permanent. Now, these, by their very numbers, are respectable, and therefore entitled to a sort of voice, not a loud one, but a modest one. Not a boastful one, but an apologetic one. They ought not be allowed much space among other people who did something, I'll grant you that. But they at least ought to be allowed to state why they didn't do anything, and to explain the process by which they didn't do anything. Certainly this kind of light must have a sort of value. Now, out west there, Missouri way, there was a great deal of confusion in men's minds during the first months of that great trouble. Great deal of unsettledness, leaning first this way, and then that, and then the other way again. It's hard for us to get our bearings. Now, I recall an instance of this one time. I was co-piloting a riverboat on the Mississippi when South Carolina had gone out of the Union on the 20th of December, 1860. My pilot mate was a New Yorker, and he was strong for the Union. So was I. But he would not listen to me with any patience. My loyalty was smirched to his eye because my father had owned slaves. Well, I said in palliation of this dark fact that I heard my father say one day before he died that slavery was a great wrong, and he would release the solitary Negro he then owned if he could think it right to give away the property of the family. When they were so straitened in means. My mate retorted that a mere impulse was nothing. Anyone could pretend to a good impulse. He went on liveling my ancestry, decrying my unionism. About a month later, secession atmosphere greatly thickened on the lower Mississippi. He became a rebel. So did I. We was together on the 26th of January, 61, in New Orleans when Louisiana went out of the Union. He did his full share of rebel shouting, but was bitterly opposed to letting me do mine. Said I came a bad stock. From a father who had been willing to set slaves free. About a month later, he was piloting a federal riverboat and shouting for the Union again, and I was in the Confederate Army. Now, I held his note for some borrowed money, and he was one of the most upright men I ever did know, but he repudiated that note without hesitation because I was a rebel and the son of a man who owned slaves. That summer, first summer 1861, the first wash of the wave of war broke upon the shores of Missouri. Our state was invaded by Union forces. They took possession of St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks, and some other points. Our governor, Caleb Jackson, made his proclamation calling for 50,000 militia to repel the invaders. Well, the beginning of the war pretty much shut down commercial traffic on the Mississippi. So I decided to take some time for myself. Went back to the little town where my boyhood had been spent, Hannibal, Missouri. Renewed some old acquaintances. What a time we had. Several of us young bucks would get together in the evening and we would carouse half the night. And once we heard Governor Jackson's proclamation, we got together in a secret place one night and decided to form ourselves into a military company. We figured we'd best hurry up and get into this skirmish before it's over, and we miss out on all the glory and excitement. Well, one Tom Lyman, young fellow with a good deal of spirit but no military experience, was made captain. I was made second lieutenant. We never had no first lieutenant. I don't remember why, I was so long ago. Well, there were about 15 of us, and on the advice of one young innocent among us, we decided to call ourselves the Marion Rangers. The Marion Rangers. I do not think anybody found fault with that name. I certainly did not. I thought it sounded just fine. Now, that young fellow who proposed this name was probably a good example of the kind of stuff we was made of. He was young, ignorant, good-natured, well-meaning, trivial, full of romance, given to reading chivalric novels and singing forlorn love ditties. But he had some pathetic little nickel-plated aristocratic instinct and detested his name, which was Dunlap. Detested it. Partly because I suppose it was as common as Smith in those parts, but mostly I think because it had kind of a plebeian sound to his ear. So he decided decided to ennoble it, give it a French pronunciation. Started calling himself Dunlop. Dunlop. And then he did the bravest thing that could be imagined. When one considers how the world is given to resenting shams and affectations, he started to write his name that way. Dunlop. Little D, big U, little N, big L, AP. And he waded through the long storm of mud that was flooding at his work of art. But he had his reward at last, for he lived to see that name accepted and the emphasis put where he wanted it, by the very people who had known him all his life, for whom the tribe of Dunlap were as common as the rain and sunshine for 40 years. So sure a victory at last is the patience that can wait. But he proved useful to us in his own way, though. He named our camps and our campaigns for us. And he generally struck a name which was, well, no slouch, as the boys would say. But that's one example. Another is Ed Stevens, son of the town jeweler. He's trim-built, handsome, graceful, neat as a cat, bright, educated, but given over entirely to fun. To him, this life was just one big joke. As far as he was concerned, this military expedition of ours was simply a holiday fry. I suppose about half of us looked upon it the same way, not consciously perhaps, but unconsciously. We did not think, but we were not capable of it. As for myself, I was full of unreasoning joy to be done with turning on a bed at midnight or 4 in the morning at the behest of a riverboat captain. Grateful to have a change, new scenes, new interest in life. My thoughts, that's about as far as I went. I did not go into the details of war. As a rule, one doesn't at 24. Well, another example was Smith, the blacksmith's apprentice. This vast donkey had some pluck. He was of a slow and sluggish nature, but a soft heart. At one moment he would get riled, he would punch out and knock down a mule for some impropriety. The next moment he'd get homesick, he'd cry. He had one ultimate credit to his account with some of us hadn't. He stuck to the war and was killed in battle at last. Now Joe Bowers, there's another example. He was a huge, good-natured, flat-headed lover, lazy, sentimental, full of harmless brag, a grumbler by nature, an experienced, industrious, and often quite picturesque liar. Yet not a very good one, for he had no intelligent training, no schooling. He was just allowed to grow up just any old way. This life was serious enough to him, seldom satisfactory, but he was a good fellow anyway, and the boys all liked him. He was made orderly sergeant. Stevens was made corporal. Well, these examples will answer for us, and they are fair ones. Well, this herd of cattle started for the war. What could you expect of them? They did the best they knew how, but really what was justly to be expected of them? Nothing, I should say. That's just pretty much what they did. Now we waited for a dark night, for caution and secrecy were necessary. Then toward midnight we strolled out of town alone or in couples to meet up at the Griffith's place south of town. And there we set out together on foot. Now Hannibal lies at the extreme southeast section of Marion County along the Mississippi. Our objective that night was the little hamlet of New London, Rawls County, 10 miles away. That first hour was all idle fun and nonsense, all laughter. That could not be kept up. The steady trudging came to be like work, and the fun had somehow oozed out of it. The stillness of the woods and the darkness of the night began to throw a depressing influence over the spirit of the boys. And the talking stopped, and each man shut himself up in his own thoughts. During the last half of the second hour, nobody said a word. Well, it was then that we came upon an old farmhouse, old log farmhouse. where according to report there was a detachment of 5 Union soldiers. Lyman called a halt. There in the deep gloom of the overhanging branches, he began to whisper a plan of assault upon that house, which made the gloom more depressing than it was before. It was a critical moment, we realized, with sudden coldness. There was no jest. We was face to face with actual war. There was no hesitation in our reply, no indecision. We told Lyman that if he's bound and determined to meddle with those soldiers, that he could go ahead and do it. If he waited for us to follow him, he'd have to wait an awful long time. Well, Lyman urged, he pleaded, he tried to shame us. It had no effect. Our course was plain, our minds were made up. We would flank that farmhouse and go out around. That's just what we did. And we struck into the woods, and we entered upon a very rough time, stumbling over roots, getting tangled in vines, getting torn by briars. At last we reached an open spot next to a woods in a big field, and sat down, blown and hot, to cool off and nurse our scratches and our bruises. Lyman was annoyed, but the rest of us were feeling just fine. We had flanked that farmhouse. We had done our first military maneuver, and it was a success. We had nothing to fret. We were feeling just fine. Now the horseplay and laughing started again, and the expedition had come a holiday frolic once more. And then we had about 2 hours of dull trudging, ultimate silence and depression. And then about dawn, we straggled into New London, soiled, heel blistered, fagged with our little march, all except Stevens in a sour and raspy humor, and privately down on the road. Well, we stacked our shabby old shotguns in Colonel Rawls' barn and went in a mass and breakfasted with that celebrated veteran of the Mexican War. After breakfast, he took us to a meadow under the branches of a huge oak tree. He gave us, listened to an old-fashioned speech from him, full of gunpowder and glory, full of that mixed metaphor and windy declamation that was regarded as eloquence in that ancient time in that remote region. And then he swore us to be faithful on the Bible to the state of Missouri, and to drive all invaders from her soil, no matter whence they might come or under what flag they might march. When he closed those solemnities by belting around me the sword that his neighbor, Colonel Brown, had worn at Molino del Rey in the Battle of Buena Vista. He accompanied this act with another impressive blast of oratory. Well, then we formed in line of battle and marched about 4 miles to a pleasant piece of woods, shady piece of woods, on the borders of a far-reaching expanse of a flowery prairie. It was an enchanting region for war. Well, our kind of war. We pierced the forest about a half mile and took up a strong position next some low, rocky and hilly hills with a limpid, purling creek in front. Straightway, half the command were in swimming. The other half were fishing. That asked what the French name gave this camp a romantic title, but it was too long. The boys simply shortened it to Camp Rawls. We occupied an old sugar maple camp, whose half-rotted troughs were still propped up against the trees. A long corn crib served as sleeping quarters for the battalion. On our left, about a mile away, was Mason's farm, and he was a friend of the cause. Well, that day, shortly after noon, several farmers came from different directions with mules and horses for our use. And these they lent us for as long as we might need them, which we all figured to be about 3 months. Those animals were all sizes, all colors, and all breeds. They were mainly young and frisky, so no one in the command could really stay on them for very long at a time. We were town boys, and ignorant kind of horsemanship. The creature that fell to me was a very small mule, yet he was so quick and active that he could throw me anytime he wanted. Which was pretty much anytime I got on him. And then he'd bray, stretch his neck out, lay his ears back, open his jaws till you could see down to his innards. He was a most disagreeable animal in every way. Now, I won't anticipate sufficiently here to say that we did learn to ride after some days' practice. Never very well. We could not, however, learn to like our animals. They were not choice ones, and most of them had annoying peculiarities of one sort or another. Stephen's horse would carry him when he wasn't looking under the low branches of the trees and knock him out of the saddle. This way, Stephen's got several bad hurts. Sergeant Bauer's horse was very large and tall with long, slim legs. He looked like a railroad bridge. His size enabled him to reach all about with his head whenever he wanted. He'd bite Bowers on the legs. On the march, laughing, Bowers would be sleeping. Horse realized not paying attention, he'd reach around and bite him on the legs. Bowers got many sores on account of that. His legs were black and blue with white, and this was about the only thing that ever made him swear. But it always did. Whenever he got to bed, he'd swear. And then Stevens, who laughed at everything, laughed at this. He'd get into such convulsions over it as to lose his balance, fall off his horse. And Stevens would be irritated enough by the bites, and then he'd resent the laughter with strong language, and inside of 5 minutes, there'd be a lot of trouble going. That horse made no end of trouble and bad blood in the command. I am feeling a little bit parched. I was wondering maybe if you just excuse me for a moment. I'm going to get something to drink. I'll be right back. Mr. Twain, there is a glass of water in your podium. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Isn't that nice? I'm sure water in moderation never hurt anybody. I always thought of water as something to be fought over. Whiskey for something to drink. I'll be right back. I'll lose yourselves for a moment. new understanding of the use of tobacco. It's fine. I don't mind. Being not much of a moderate myself, I always thought moderation was vastly overrated. I did, however, make me a resolution regarding smoking. I decided that I am not going to smoke when I'm asleep. And I am not going to refrain when I'm awake. But, as long as you're happy. Where were we? Oh yes, that first afternoon in the sugar camps. Now the sugar troughs came in very handy as horse troughs, so we had plenty of corn to fill them with. I ordered Sergeant Bowers to feed my horse, but he said if I reckoned he went to war to be a nursemaid to a mule, it shouldn't take me very long to figure out my mistake. This was insubordination. I was so full of everything, uncertainty of everything military. I let the thing go and I went and ordered Smith to feed the animal. He merely gave me a large, cold, sarcastic, toothy grin, turned his back on me. Well, I went to see the captain. I said, asked him if it was not right and proper and military for me to have an orderly. He said it was, but since there weren't but one orderly in camp, it was only right that he have Bowers on his staff. Which Bowers said he wouldn't serve on anybody's staff. Anybody thought they could make him, let him try it. The thing had to be dropped. There was no other way. Next thing, nobody would cook. It was considered servile, a degradation, so we had no dinner. And we lazed the rest of that pleasant afternoon away, some dozing under trees, some smoking corncob pipes, some talking war and sweethearts, some playing cards. By late evening, all hands were famished, and to meet the difficulty, all hands turned to and gathered wood, built the fires, and cooked the food. Then everything was pretty serene there after a while, until trouble broke out for the sergeant and the corporal, each claimed to outrank the other, since nobody knew which rank was of the higher office. I had to settle the matter by making the rank of both officers equal. The commander of an ignorant crew like that had many troubles and vexations which probably do not occur in the regular army at all. However, with the song singing and the yarn spinning by the campfire, everything presently became serene, and by we raked down the corn on one end of the crib and went to bed on it. Tied a horse to the door, so he'd whinny in case anyone tried to get in. Now we had horsemanship drill every forenoon. Then in the afternoons, we'd ride off in little squads here and there and visit the farmers' daughters. Had a youthful good time. Got an honest to good supper or dinner. Went back to camp happy and content. For a time, life was idly delicious. There was nothing to mar it. Then came some farmers with an alarm one day. They said it was rumored that the enemy were advancing in our direction from over Hyde's Prairie. The result was a sharp stir amongst us and great consternation. It was a rude awakening from out our pleasant trance. Now, the rumor was but a rumor, nothing definite about it. So in the confusion, we did not know which way to go. Lyman was for not retreating at all, but he found that if he maintained that attitude, he'd fare pretty badly because the command were in no position to put up with insubordination. So he yielded the point and called a council of war. Question was which way to retreat. Everybody was so worried that nobody even had a guest to offer except Lyman. He said in a few calm words that inasmuch as the enemy was approaching over Hyde's Prairie, that our course was simple. We only had to not retreat toward him. Any other direction would suit our purposes just fine. Everyone saw and knowing how true this was, and how wise, and Lyman got a good many compliments out of it. Well, it was decided then that we were going to fall back on Mason's farm. It was after dark by this time, and as we could not know how soon the enemy would be upon us, we decided it best not to take the animals and the gear with us. So we grabbed our guns and ammunition, headed out. That route was very rough and very hilly and very rocky. Presently the night grew very black and it started to rain. So we had a troublesome time of it, struggling and stumbling along in the dark. Pretty soon some fella would slip and fall, and the next person behind him would slip and fall over him, and so did the rest, one after the other. Bowers came with the keg of gunpowder in his arms, while the whole detachment were all tangled up together, arms and legs, and he fell, of course. That started the whole detachment down the slope in a mass, and we landed in the brook at the bottom. Each man that was undermost was pulling the hair, biting and scratching those on top of him. The people being bitten and scratched were scratching and biting everyone else in their turn. Oh, it was a terrible sight to behold. Now all saying they would die before they ever go to war again. The country might rock for all they care. And the invader along with them. All such talk as that, which was dismal to hear and take part in such low, smothered voices, and so dark and wet. And what with the enemy may be coming at any moment. Now, the keg of gunpowder was lost, some of the guns were too. So the growling and complaining continued straight along while the boys pawed around the pasty hillside looking for these items. Consequently, we lost a lot of time at this. Then we heard a sound. Everyone stopped to listen. It seemed to be the enemy coming, though it could have been a cow. We had the cough of a cow, but we did not wait. We struck out for Mason's just as quickly as we could stumble along in the dark. We left a few of the guns behind as well. Presently, we got lost in a couple of those little ravines there, and that wasted some more time before we got to Mason's stile. And just as we were to open our mouths to give the countersign, over the fence bounded a half a dozen dogs with loud noise and wrenched. They grabbed soldiers by the slack of their pants and started backing away with them. We could not shoot the dogs they were attached to for fear of hitting the man they were attached to. We looked on helpless. At what was probably the most mortifying spectacle of the Civil War. And pretty soon the Masons came out on the porch with candles in their hands, and the old man and the boy got the dogs loose. Well, most of the dogs loose. They couldn't get Bowers off. Yeah, they did eventually with some scalding water, which Bowers got his share. Promptly returned Hindu thanks. And we went into the house. The old man began to ask it a world of questions concerning, well, it presently came out that we did not know who or what we were running from. The old gentleman made himself very frank, and he said we was a curious breed of soldiers. But he guessed we could be depended upon to wind up the war in time. For no government could afford the shoe leather it should cost trying to follow us around. And he wanted to know why we hadn't placed a picket guard at the place where the road entered the prairie. Why we hadn't sent out a scouting party to spy out the enemy, bring back a report of his strength, and so on, before jumping up from a strong position on a mere vague rumor. You know, that made us shabbier than the dogs had done. Not half so enthusiastically welcome. So we went to bed that night shamed and low-spirited, and we got but little sleep. For after all we'd gone through, we were not done for the night. For about 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard a shout of warning from down the lane, accompanied by a chorus from all the dogs. In the moment, everyone was up and flying around trying to find out what the alarm was about. That messenger was a horseman who gave notice that a detachment of Union soldiers was on its way from Hannibal, with orders to capture and hang any rebel bands like ours that it might find. Farmer Mason was in a flurry himself this time. He hurried us out of the house with all haste. Sent his nigger to show us where to hide ourselves and our telltale guns in the ravines about a half-mile away. It was raining heavily. And we struck down the plain, across some rocky pasture which afforded good opportunities for falling. Consequently, we were down in the mud most of the time. Every time a man went down, he blackguarded the war and the people that started it. Gave himself the master dose of all for being willing to go into it. Finally, we reached some wooded mouth of a ravine, and there under the streaming trees, we sent the Negro back home and had a miserable and heartbreaking night of it. We were like to be drowned with the rain, like to be deafened with the howling wind and the thunder, or blinded by the lightning. It was indeed a wild night. And the drenching we were getting was bad enough, but worse still was the thought that a noose might end us before we was a day older. Death of that shameful sort is not occurred to me as being a possibility of war. Took the romance all out of the campaign, turned our dreams of glory into a repulsive nightmare. And the long night finally wore itself out, and then Negro came and told us that the rumor had manifestly been a false one. But that breakfast would be ready shortly. Straightway we were light-hearted again, and the world was bright and full of hope and promise as ever, for we were young then. How long ago that was. Well, that mongrel child of philology named that camp, that refuge, Camp Devastation, and not a soul objected. The Masons gave us a Missouri breakfast in Missouri in abundance, and we needed it. Hot biscuits, hot wheat bread, prettily crisscrossed on top in a lattice pattern, fried chicken, hot corn pone, bacon, eggs, coffee, buttermilk. And the world may be confidently challenged to serve such a breakfast as it is served in the South. Well, we stayed at Mason's for several days. After all these years, the memory of the dullness, the stillness, and the lifelessness of that slumberous farmhouse still oppresses my spirit, as with a sense of the presence of death and mourning. There was nothing to do, nothing to think about, and no interest in life. The men of the house were away in the field all day, and the women were out of sight doing their thing. The only sound was the plaintive wailing of a spinning wheel, forever moaning out from some room. The most lonesome sound in nature, a sound steeped and sodden with homesickness and emptiness of life. That family went to bed about dark every night. Since we were not invited to introduce any new customs, we naturally followed theirs. Those nights were 100 years long. The young boys used to being up half the night. We grew old and decrepit waiting for those morning clock strikes. This was no place for town boys. So it was, at last, with a sort of joy that we received word that the enemy were on our track again. With a new birth of the old warrior spirit, we sprang to line of battle, fell back on camp walls. Now Lyman had taken a hint from Mr. Mason's talk, and he now gave orders that our camp should be guarded from surprise by the posting of pickets. Now that night shut down, dark and threatening. I told Sergeant Bowers to go out that place in the fork of the road and stay till midnight. Just as I was expecting, he said he wouldn't do it. Tried to get others to go, but all refused. Some excused themselves on account of weather, but most just were frank enough to say they wouldn't go in any kind of weather. That kind of thing sounds odd now and impossible, but there was no surprise in it at the time. On the contrary, it was a perfectly natural thing to do. There were scores of little camps scattered all over Missouri where the same thing was happening. Now these camps were composed mainly of young men who had been born and reared to a sturdy independence, and who did not know what it meant to be ordered around by Tom, Dick, or Harry, whom they had known familiarly all their lives in the village or on the farm. Quite within probabilities that the same thing was happening all over the South. fact, the author, James Redpath, recognized the justice of this assumption and furnished the following instance in support of it. Seems during a short stay in East Tennessee, he was in a civilian colonel's tent one day talking when a big private appeared at the door. And without salute or other ceremony, he said to the colonel, "Say, Jim, I'm going home for a few days." The colonel say, "What for?" He said, "Well, I ain't been there in a right smart while, and I'd like to see how things is coming on." The colonel asked, "How long are you going to be gone?" He said, "Oh, about 2 weeks." The colonel said, "Well, don't be gone any longer, and I'll get back sooner if you can." That was all. The citizen soldier resumed his conversation with the private and broken it off. Well, this was in the first months of the war, of course. Our camps in the part of Mississippi, or Missouri, were under the command of Brigadier General Thomas H. Harris. Now, he was a townsman of ours. First-rate fellow and well-liked. But we had all familiarly known him all of our lives as the sole and modest salaried operator of the telegraph office, where he had to send about 1 dispatch a week in normal times, and 2 if there was a rush of business. So it was not surprising when he appeared in our midst one day on the wing and delivered a military command of some sort in a large military fashion. We were not surprised at the response that he got. "Oh, now, Tom Harris, what do you want to do a thing like that for?" It was quite the natural thing. One might justly imagine that we were hopeless material for war, and so we seemed in our ignorant state. But there were those among us who learned that grim trade later, and learned to obey like machines, become valuable soldiers, fought all through the war, and came out at the end with excellent records. One young man refused to go out on picket duty that night, was cited for bravery before he was a year older. We never did establish a watch anymore at night. We generally kept one out during the day. Never at night as far as I remember. Anyway, back at the camp. The whole command slept in the corn in the big corn crib, and there was usually a row before morning, for the place was full of rats. And they would scramble over the boys' bodies and across the boys' faces. Every once in a while, one would bite someone on the toe. The person who owned the toe would start up and magnify his English and start throwing corn in the dark. Those cobs were about half as heavy as bricks, and when they hit, they hurt. The person being struck would respond with more artillery. Before you know it, everyone was locked in a death grip with his neighbors. There was a grievous deal of blood spent in that corn grip. About all the blood that was spilled while I was in it. No, that's not true. No, that's not true. It's not all the blood that was spilled. But for one instance, it would be. Now, I promise to tell you the truth. That's what I'm going to do, whether we like it or not. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind if I took a few minutes break before we get into this nasty business. Amuse yourselves, and I'll be back in just a minute. fine. Probably going to get warm enough in here the way it is. You got to understand, our scares were frequent, and our fears were honest. Seems every few days rumor would come that the enemy were approaching. In these cases, we always fell back on some other camp or other of ours. We never stayed put where we were. But the rumors always turned out to be false. So even at last, we began to grow indifferent to it. One night, a Negro was sent to the crib, told us that the enemy was hovering in the neighborhood. We said, oh, let him hover. We resolved to stay where we are and be comfortable. We were having a very jolly time. No doubt that resolution put a good military stir in our bones. But that did not last. As the horseplay and school boy hilarity fell off, it was replaced with uneasiness, worry, apprehension. Since we had said that we would stay, we were committed. Now, we could have been talked into leaving, but nobody was brave enough to suggest it. Almost noiseless movement began in the corn crib. Before it was over, everybody realized they weren't the only ones up front with their eyeballs between the cracks in the log. We were all there. All there with our hearts in our throats, staring out towards the sugar troughs where the prairie opened. There was a veiled moonlight. It was barely just strong enough to make out the general shapes of objects. Presently, a muffled sound caught our ears, and we recognized it as hoofbeats. Horses, yeah. Pretty soon we saw a man on horseback. His mask had such little sharpness of outline, could hardly see him. You could see it was a man on horseback. It seemed to me that there were others behind him. I got a hold of my gun in the dark and I pushed it through a crack in the logs, hardly knowing what I was doing. I was so dazed with fright. Pretty soon we listened, he got a little closer, closer. Someone said, fire, and I fired. I heard 100 reports, saw 100 flashes. We saw the man fall down on the saddle. My first inclination was surprise gratification. My first impulse was an apprentice sportsman's impulse to run and pick up his game. Someone said, good, we got him, I'll wait for the rest. The rest never came. We waited, we listened, still nobody came. Then wondering, we crept out and approached the man. When we got to him, the moon revealed him distinctly. He was lying on his back with his arms abroad, his mouth open and his chest was heaving with long gasps. His white shirt front was splashed with blood. The thought shot through me that I was a murderer, that I had killed a man. A man who had never done me any harm. That was the coldest sensation that ever went through my marrow. I was down by him in a moment, stroking his forehead. Now to give anything just then, my own life freely, to make him what he was just 5 minutes before. All the boys seemed to be feeling the same way. They hung over him, full of pity and interest, and tried to help him all they could. Said all sorts of regretful things. They'd forgotten about the enemy. They thought only of this one forlorn unit of the foe. He muttered and mumbled like a dreamer in his sleep. Talked about his wife and his child. And I thought with a new despair. This thing that I have done does not end with him. It falls upon them too. And they never did me any harm, any more than he. A little while the man was dead. Killed in battle, killed in fair and legitimate war, one might say. And yet he was as sincerely mourned by the opposing force as if he'd been their own brother. And the boy stood there half hour sorrowing over him and recalling the details of the tragedy and wondering who he might be and if he might be a spy, saying that if it were to do over again, they wouldn't shoot at him unless he shot at them first. It soon came out that mine was not the only shot fired. There were 5 others. A division of the guilt which was a great relief to me, since it in some degree lightened and diminished the burden I was carrying. The man was not in uniform. He was not armed. He was a stranger in the country. That's all we ever found out about him. The thought of him got to preying upon me every night. I could not get rid of it. I could not drive it away. The taking of that unoffended life seemed such a wanton thing. And it seemed the epitome of war. That all war was just that. The killing of strangers against you whom you feel no personal animosity. Strangers whom in other circumstances would help you if you needed it. Or you would help if you could. My campaign was spoiled. It seemed to me that I was not rightly cut out for this nasty business. That war was intended for men. I was but an overgrown child. I resolved to retire from this avocation of sham soldiery, while I still had some remnant of self-respect. These morbid thoughts clung to me against all reason. For at the bottom, I did not believe that I had anything to do with his death. In all my short experience with guns, I never hit anything I tried to hit. And I know that I tried to hit him. Yet there was no solace in this thought. Against a deep, diseased imagination, demonstration goes for nothing. Well, the rest of my war experience was with a parcel of what I just told you. We kept monotonously falling back on one camp after another. In fact, that last camp that we fell back on was in a little hollow near Florida, Missouri, where I was born, Monroe County. There were several other small troops there with us. And here we were warned one day that a Union colonel was sweeping down on us with a whole regiment at his heels. This one looked decidedly serious. Our command went apart and consulted. And we went back and told the other company's president that the war was a big disappointment to us and we was going to disband. They were getting ready themselves to fall back on some point or other. We're only waiting for General Tom Harris, who was expected shortly. But about half of us, we said no, we ain't going to wait. We're used to falling back. We don't need any of Tom Harris's help to do it. We can save time too. Well, about half of us mounted and left on the instant. The rest gave in to persuasion and stayed. We stayed through the war. About an hour later, we met General Harris on the road with 2 or 3 people in his company. His staff probably, but we could not tell. No one was in uniform. Uniforms hadn't come into vogue yet. No, we told him there was a colonel coming with a whole regiment in his wake. He ordered us back. We told him we concluded to go home. There was going to be a terrible row. Now, he raged a little, but it was of no use. Our minds were made up. We had done our share. We had killed 1 man, exterminated 1 army, such as it be. Let him go and kill the rest, and the war will be over. In time, I came to know that Union colonel whose coming frightened me out of the war and crippled the Southern cause to that extent. Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant. Came within a few hours of seeing him, and he was as unknown as I was myself. At a time when anybody could have said, Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant. I do not remember that name. Seems difficult to realize there was such a time when that remark could be rationally made. But there was. And I was within a few miles, and the occasion too, though proceeding in the other direction. Now the thoughtful among you, I hope, will not throw this war paper of mine aside lightly, as being valueless. It has this value. It has this value. It is not an unfair picture of what went on in many, many militia camps in the first months of that great rebellion, when the green troops were without discipline, without a steadying and hardening influence of trained leaders, when all their circumstances were new and strange, and charged with exaggerated terrors. And before the invaluable experience of actual collision in the field turned them from rabbits into soldiers. Now, if this side of the picture of that early days has not before been put into history, then history is incomplete without it. For it has it, and it has its rightful place there. There was more Bull Run material scattered through the early camps in this country than it exhibited itself at Bull Run. And yet many learned its grim trade presently and helped to fight great battles later. I could have been a soldier if I waited. I got part of it earned. I knew more about retreating than the man that invented retreating. I got to be careful of the time here. I promised I'd be back at a certain time. That old boy get devilishly upset if I don't make it. Thank you very much for your time. Be good, help each other.